Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Carrie Butcher. I am City Market's Assistant Outreach and Education Manager. I'm one who's been sending you all of the emails, so now you can put part of a face to a name. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's quiche class. I'm super excited about this one. I love quiche. It's awesome. I will be behind the scenes for most of this. This is the only time you'll see me, but you'll hear my voice. If at any point you have questions, you can put them into the question and answer box on Teams. I'll go back and I'll make an announcement in that box so you can see where it is. I will save questions for good stopping points during this class. There's a lot to get through in this class, so I won't be throwing out your questions as they come in. I'll save them for good stopping points, but we will get to them, don't worry. So anytime if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the box and I will see all of those come in and I can feed them to our instructor as it becomes necessary. If you're joining us a little bit late, you can always hit live. It's down near the bottom by the play pause button. That will catch you up to where we are rather than starting you from the very beginning. So that'll catch you up and you can join the rest of the class live. I think that's it from me, but I will turn things over to our instructor. You'll hear from me again. Like I said, you'll hear my voice kind of interjecting with questions and put those into the chat as they come in. Thanks. Yeah, take it away.
Good evening. My name is Anna, and I will be the instructor tonight. It's really a fun class this evening. I'm very excited to be able to teach a very hands-on demo for how to make a French quiche. I lived in France a number of years when I was younger and really fell in love with French quiche, especially the tenderness and crumb of the crust. And I think that that's something that nowadays, you know, it's easy to buy a store-bought crust, but it just is not the same. And so the goal of this class is to be able to teach you how to make a traditional French quiche crust from scratch without any mechanized equipment. Feel free to then use that recipe for your food processor if you are in a hurry. It will also work with that. But yeah, the goal is to really teach you sort of the French or Alsace-Lorraine quiche as it was originally made with some specialty ingredients. The idea for this class came about maybe a month or so ago when Carrie and I were talking about a fun class to do sort of the week before Mother's Day. And we had the idea that a quiche would be sort of something fun in case anyone wanted to bake their mother a quiche on Sunday. But also I wanted to teach a recipe that would encourage us to get out and about in the woods and the meadows at this time of year here in Vermont. We're sort of suddenly facing all of these just beautiful greens that are coming up. It's been a long, cold winter here, and I think that this time of spring, this early time with all the ephemerals out, is just a really special time. I think it's, you know, it's before we're seeing any of the local fresh produce in the grocery stores. We don't yet have our farmers markets happening, and it's really the way to get your freshest greens this time of year. So I'm going to be teaching the basic quiche recipe plus the addition of wild greens that are just out and about here in the Burlington area. So to encourage anyone to, you know, if you've been out foraging or if you want to get out this weekend, it should be something fun you can do with your greens. And then of course I'll be talking about later on what you can add during the gardening season from the garden to kind of beef up these quiches. It's a very versatile recipe and can have lots of additions. So before we begin, I just wanted to say a little bit about my background and the history of quiche making. I did my culinary training at the Cordon Bleu, a French culinary school, so that's very much my sort of take on things. And so I'm going to be trying to teach you the recipe as I was taught in school, and as well as some just general baking techniques that I find helpful. So to begin, it's great to just use, and this is something I'm going to be going into a little more detail in later on, but I wondered just, can I see a maybe show of hands in the chat box, how many people are going to be baking along tonight as we're going? This was designed as a demo, so feel free to just, you know, sit back and watch and take notes. But if anyone is baking along, this is actually a good class to do that for, because I will be going relatively slowly as I talk about the technique with the dough. So that'll be exciting to hear if anyone's baking a quiche with us tonight. So just a word about quiche in general. So we think of this dish as very much a French classic, and that it is. However, the use of egg and cream to bake a custard dates way back even before the sort of origin of the quiche as we think of it. All the way back in the 13th century, the Italians, there's been documentation of Italians making a custard, and then the English started making custard in the 14th century. But it wasn't until the 1600s that we have the first reference to quiche making in France. And that was actually in the Alsace region in northeastern France. And if you've got your handout, there's a map where you can see the quiche really, we believe, originated in this region, which is a very interesting part of France because it borders 3 other countries, Belgium, Germany, and Luxembourg. And all of these countries have sort of vied for this part of land around the Rhine River. And so the Alsace-Lorraine region has really gone back and forth between Germany and France and has a lot of German influence. The word quiche, we believe, comes from the German word Kuchen for cake or tart. And so we can sort of see its origins there. But the sort of first reference to quiche, we believe, was in 1605 in the Lorraine patois, which is the sort of local language in the Lorraine region. And so we can at least say by the early 1600s, quiche was being made. So that's sort of as far back as I've been able to trace it. And it's become very popular throughout France at this point. After the World War II in Great Britain, quiche was extremely popular. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But yeah, it's a classic dish. I think we all know the quiche Lorraine, which has the cheese, egg, cream, and then the lardon, or the sort of baking bit in it. And yeah, I'm going to go into a little more detail as we're baking about that. But quiche can be vegetarian. It can have seafood or fish. It can have meat. Whatever is really, in your diet and your preferred fillings. There are also some really good recipes for gluten-free crust. It is possible to make a good quiche crust with a gluten-free dough. So even if you're gluten intolerant, yeah, don't worry. But tonight I'm going to be teaching you the recipe for pâte brisée, which is a short crust pastry. And it's a very classic recipe that can be used both for sweet as well as savory doughs. And it's the same recipe you would use for baking a pie, except for without the white sugar. So to begin with, it's really great if at all possible to scale out your ingredients for a quiche crust using weight rather than volume. If you've taken my classes before, you've heard me give this spiel, but basically volume can vary so much depending on how you scoop flour or how you scoop the sugar, and it's just much more exact and precise, especially when we're dealing with baking measurements that's more sort of a science, if we can scale it out by weight. The other reason that that's helpful is that if you're measuring by weight, especially using the metric system, grams, as opposed to ounces, it's a lot easier to scale up or down a recipe and sort of do your divisions or multiplications. So if you take a look at this recipe, it's sort of a classic 2-to-1 recipe in terms of the flour to fat content. So we're going to start with 200 grams of flour and then 100 grams of butter. Now, in terms of a flour, traditionally pastry doughs are made with a flour that contains less gluten than a bread flour. But pastry flour can be a little tough to find, and it works perfectly well to use all-purpose flour, which is sort of a middle ground between a high protein bread flour and a low protein cake flour. So if you have cake flour on hand, you can also use that. But in this recipe, I'm going to just use all-purpose flour. And we're going to begin by measuring out the flour. So what we do is turn our scale on, toward the bowl, bringing it to 0. And I'm going to put in my flour. So that's exactly 200 grams. I scaled it out ahead of time. Then you're gonna put in a pinch of salt. The French are not very specific with their seasonings, with their salts or spices. So it's a lot of it is by taste. It's often we say like au pif, which is sort of by how your nose wants it to be, how you smell it or taste it. So I'm just gonna put a pinch of salt in. If you are making a sweet dough, this is the point where you would add the sugar as well. And then just using a whisk, this is sort of the quickest way to blend in your salt into the flour. And then we're going to add our butter. So does anyone know how much one stick of butter weighs in grams, roughly? So if you imagined that this is 200 grams of flour, this should be roughly 100 grams. So a stick of butter is generally 113 grams. So that's why in the recipe, I had you just slice off a little bit from the end. It was funny because when I did a trial bake this morning to show you one that's finished, and I was measuring out the stick of butter, and it was actually less than 100 grams. I was very shocked. But yes. So you want your butter to be as cold as possible. It's best to keep it in the fridge until right before you're using it, or even just put it in the freezer briefly. I'm going to slice off just about the sort of 10 grams. And I forgot to mention that your fat that you choose to use in a quiche crust is very important. This is what's going to give it its flavor and sort of that richness. So I like to try to find a butter that has the highest fat content possible. In the US, that's about an 85% fat content. That's why I'm using this. This is Vital Farms pasture-raised butter. We have it here at City Market. If you're lucky enough to have a homestead butter or a farmer near you that's raising their cattle on pasture and making their own butter, often you can get a homestead butter that's going to even push that fat content up a little bit more. The other alternative, and this is something that I'll talk a little bit more about when the quiche is baking, is lard. Leaf lard from the underbelly around the kidneys of pigs has been historically used for baking for centuries. And we believe that's probably what was used in the Alsace region originally, because it was probably cheaper than butter at that point. So if you do have access to lard, that's a great alternative. And some people like to do 50-50. So the thinking behind that is that the lard is what gives your crust really that great texture and flakiness. It does a really good job of sort of distributing the moisture, and then the butter adds flavor. So if you do 50-50, it's going to give you sort of the best of both worlds. And that's what I did for the quiche I baked this morning that I'll show you at the end.
I think that's a perfect time for a quick question if you don't mind. Mark asks, can you make a vegan quiche, or would that no longer be a quiche?
Oh, great question. Hi, Mark. I would say you absolutely could. I think in this day and age, maybe some French chefs would disagree with me, but I believe that, dietary sort of changing recipes a little bit is totally fine. I think you could absolutely make a crust with a different fat, such as maybe coconut oil. That's a great fat. You could even use olive oil. I think, yeah, there are lots of ways. And I think in terms of the filling, I think lots of substitutes for the dairy part. So absolutely, I would still call that a quiche. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So this butter is not quite as chilled as I would ideally want it. So just keep in mind that make sure your butter is really cold for this part. You're going to slice it into very small squares. The smaller the better. It's going to save you time and effort later on if you get your squares as small as possible. You're basically mincing butter or aiming at this stage without smearing it. And so you can see the way my butter is responding, that it's not fully chilled. You should be able to do this and have sort of separate pieces of the butter.
It set out when we were prepping.
Yes, we were prepping for a good hour and it's sitting out. But it's a good learning opportunity to show you, yes, do as I say, not as I'm doing with the butter. All right, the next step is to form a little bit of a nest in the center of your bowl. And traditionally, a lot of pastry chefs would do this actually on a flat pastry board. And we're going to do that later on. We're going to use the board, but it's a little easier in a bowl. You want to make sure that you're using a wide mouth bowl. Think of it almost like a large plate that's sort of receiving the flour, because you're going to be doing a lot of hand work with the butter. So we are going to coat the butter with flour. Make sure your hands are fully coated, and we're going to slowly break up the butter into the flour. This part is called sablé or sablage, and it comes from the French word sable, sand, which means sand or sort of grains. And so what we're aiming to do is to get the butter broken up into tiny pieces so it looks almost like sand. And so once it's broken a little bit and fully coated with the flour so it's not going to stick on your hand, you can then start rubbing it between both hands. And this is how you actually are getting that sable effect.
Nancy asks, could the butter be frozen? I've also seen some recipes that grate frozen butter.
Yes, yes, and that's absolutely something you can do. I was saying to Carrie earlier, yeah, you can stick the butter in the freezer ahead of time. Yeah, it's a little bit harder. You don't want it like completely frozen, but like almost frozen is great. Yeah, and absolutely grating it in. Well, I think by grating it so finely, the fact that it's completely frozen isn't a problem, because it will quickly sort of heat to your hand temperature as you're working it. But yeah, your aim is to get it broken up before it gets sort of too hot, and later on without sort of overworking the dough. So, and anybody who's done pie baking before has heard this. The key to a good pie crust, quiche or sweet crust, is not to overwork the dough. And in my opinion, my experience, that is the main reason not to use a food processor. When I'm in a hurry, I do use a food processor for a quiche crust. However, I really have noticed the difference. What happens is the food processor, even if you're doing it at minimal number of turns, it is breaking up the gluten strands and making them sort of elongated, which then makes for a tougher crust. So I've never been able to get the flakiness of a handmade crust with a food processor crust. So I think that's why the French pastry chefs are so strict about doing it the hand method. The other goal is that you're wanting to break up the butter, but you don't want it to be fully blended in completely with the flour. You actually want to have little specks of butter showing in your dough. Why is that? It's that as the butter melts, it creates then these air pockets that allows the air to kind of puff up, and that's what gives you the flakiness. If you think of a croissant crust with all the different layers, that's sort of, you're creating a mini croissant crust layering effect by not blending it completely up. And if you do use a food processor, that's generally what happens, is your butter, you don't have those flecks of butter anymore. So once you have the sand effect of the butter and flour, we are then going to add the eggs.
I want to ask if we can use a pastry blender.
Yes, if you are lucky enough to have a pastry blender, absolutely. That's a good use for it. So just a note about eggs. Again, if you've done my classes, you've heard me say this before, so I apologize if it's repetition, but it's good practice to just actually smell an egg before you're using it. Sometimes eggs can go off. It's not very often that they do, but I generally break my eggs into a bowl first. And just give it a good smell and make sure it's not rancid or not rotten, and then put it in. So we've got 2 eggs and full eggs, and then 1 yolk. And you feel free to, use the rest of the white. I'm giving you sort of the classic recipe. I find it's a little wasteful unless you have something clever to do with that 1 egg white. So you can add the full third egg. That's totally fine. It will be just like a tad less sort of yellow and rich, but it will still be good. So then this part I like to do using a fork. You're going to slowly incorporate the egg yolk into the flour. Some recipes call for adding the water, which is your last remaining liquid, and you do need a little bit of water to get the dough soft enough. Some recipes recommend adding that now at this stage. However, the way we were taught is that the protein from the egg has to sort of bind with the flour in order for it to not sort of get overworking the flour. And that if you add the water, that's going to basically make your flour into sort of a goo and the glue. And it's going to sort of make those proteins in the gluten of the flour get overworked. So that's sort of the way that I do it then. But if you're in a hurry, I'm sure you could add the water earlier. So it doesn't need to be fully incorporated, just enough that your flour is coating the egg. And then you can add between 2 to 3 tablespoons of chilled water. So I'm going to add around 2.5. Yeah. And now this part is when you can keep blending. So I can already tell that this dough is super soft, and that's again because our butter wasn't fully chilled. But not to worry.
Someone says there are listed 1 egg. Is that a typo?
Oh my goodness, no, I'm sorry. That was for the custard. Thank you so much for catching that. I was wondering why my dough was soft. So go back and correct that. This part takes only 1 egg. It's the custard that takes the 3 eggs. So yes, if you've been taking notes, please correct that. The recipe you were given is correct, the written recipe. Okay, so thank you. Thank you for catching that. I'm used to making this in much larger quantities, so my apologies. So what we're going to do in that case is we're just going to scale up the recipe three times so that we can still use it. I'm just going to grab a little more flour.
Chop. All the way up top, the red King Arthur.
Okay, and we have a little more time. Okay, so I'm going to add 2 more times the flour, so it should be about 400 grams.
This is great. This is going to be extra dough.
Now I'm
going to go take and make it.
I'm going to give poor Carrie 2 servings of extra pie dough.
Poor Carrie, nothing. This is great.
All right. So I'm just watching till we get 400 grams.
You did this on purpose so people could watch you again. They just get, repetition so you could show them again.
Right. Thank you to whoever that was following along with their recipe. I appreciate that. Okay, and now we've got the butter. We have more butter.
There's the cultured butter there too.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Awesome. Oh, so yeah, I wanted, actually, this is, yeah, I recognize the butter. This is a really great butter to use for baking. They don't list their fat content on it, but I've baked with it a lot and it's just really good. It has a great flavor. The cultured part means that they've just slightly sort of fermented or cultured it like you do with yogurt. And it just adds a little bit of extra tanginess to it. So this actually gives me a chance to show you with butter that is sufficiently chilled, what we're going to do. So you could try grating it. Otherwise, this is how your butter should behave. You should be able to chop it really finely without it kind of squishing or melting in your hand. As I'm doing this, I could take a question or two if we've got.
Someone says thoughts on using vodka for some of the water. They've seen that before.
Ooh, that's really interesting.
Evaporates faster.
Right, right. You know, I've definitely seen that in other recipes. I'm not sure if I've seen that, yeah, in a pastry crust. But yeah, you could definitely try that. That would be interesting. And I would say, yeah, something like vodka would probably be good, something with a low kind of flavor profile. So you're not, yeah, actually flavoring, just using it, yeah, as a evaporating moisture. Yeah.
That is the only question so far, other than the catching the egg thing. So
yeah, okay. Yeah, feel free to send in any other questions. So this is actually good because we'll be able to watch the dough and see kind of what we're looking for in terms of like how much water it's going to need, rather than just kind of going based on the recipe.
I think that's another reason to not add the water with the eggs. You might not.
Exactly. Your eggs may be like super like moist and big, and but yeah, you might have a lot of yolk that adds moisture. So yeah, so here, this is kind of more traditional, is to do it on a pastry board, and with a larger quantity of dough, that's sort of helpful.
Someone asks, are the eggs cold?
Yes, your eggs should be chilled as well. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and your choice of egg is really important also. It was funny because I made a couple trial batches, some using these schoolhouse farm eggs from City Market, which are organic, pasture raised. They're fed organic feed, not certified organic, but fed organic feed, which is the most important part, and pasture raised. And they're like my favorite egg here at City Market. But then I made a second batch with some eggs that a friend, she raises chickens up in the NEK, and these chickens are sort of the happiest chickens ever. They're constantly foraging on all of these grubs, and that dough was actually so much more yellow. So that was interesting to see. So if you can find, pastured eggs, like the yellower the yolk, the better for this. Again, we're trying to really boost the fat content and get lots of flavor.
Someone asked, should the recipe be modified if using vegan butter? And I'm pretty sure that would just be 1-to-1, right?
Yeah, I feel like vegan butter is designed to be used 1-to-1. So again, go by your feel of the dough. I'm going to tell you kind of what to look for, and then you can see if if your dough is behaving like that. I think the only time you would need to modify the recipe in terms of kind of, yeah, these types of ingredient substitutions is if you're using a heavier flour, like a wheat flour, that's going to take a little bit more water or liquid. I think if you're using any other grains like buckwheat flour, I've seen people do some really creative crusts with whole grains, but that's going to definitely take more liquid. Yeah. So we're going to do the sablage, the sable part here, with a lot more dough. And this is also why it's great to be able to weigh our ingredients as we go, because we'll then aim for a ball of dough that's sort of the specified weight, which is going to be easier to do by weight than by volume.
I'm super excited because I get to go experiment with quiche dough now. It's in the fridge. I might make asparagus quiche.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so asparagus is great. I have a favorite substitute for asparagus this time of year, which we'll talk about. So this is coming together. Okay.
Nancy asks, I have homemade butter from fresh milk and I have no idea what the fat content is. Are there adjustments that should be made, or again, all by touch?
Okay, so this is butter you've made. It's homemade from fresh milk. That is great. It's the milk, so it sort of all depends about the breed of cow, what they've been eating to determine the fat content. But probably it's over 80%, which is great. You don't need to make any substitution or changes to the quantity. Yeah, that should be the same. That's going to be really good. That's awesome. You've got that. So I'm adding a little bit more water. And this is the fun part. I think quiche making is really fun to do with kids because you get to sort of play with it like Play-Doh. But you are trying to incorporate relatively quickly without overworking the dough. But it is much harder to overwork dough by hand than it is with a food processor.
Mark asked if you're going to add any more salt for this larger batch.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mark.
And yes, we're sort of skipping we did the sand stage a little bit at the beginning in the bowl and then. Yeah,
and I just did the sand stage a little bit here. I over salted it earlier, so I'm just going to put a tiny bit of salt, not too much. I like to not have the crust really carry too much flavor in a quiche because your goal is to be sort of like a good pizza dough. Your goal is to have this sort of just a neutral foundation that's delicious, but then lets your custard sort of shine. All right, I'm going to add a little bit more water because ideally it would be close to 6 tablespoons is what we'd like, but I think we may not need that.
Okay, a couple more questions while you're kneading.
Yeah, any other questions?
When making, this is Nancy again, when making pasta, I weigh the eggs to get the correct flour ratio. Does that also apply?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, if you do want to be precise, you can weigh eggs, and generally in commercial kitchens, eggs are measured by weight rather than by unit. So yeah, that's great to do because eggs can really vary, especially with all the different chicken breeds out there nowadays.
Yeah, and the other one is quiche crust the same as pie crust?
Oh, great question. Yes, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, so quiche crust is really the basic pâte brisée recipe is also what's used for pie crust. In the States, there's the 3 to 2 to 1 pie crust ratio recipe you may have heard of, and that's 3 flour, sort of measuring by weight, to 2 fat to 1 liquid. So it's a little bit different, but traditionally, they're very similar. It's not a huge difference, but the pâte brisée is usually what is used for like a kind of a classic pie crust. Yeah. The short crust pastry. Okay, so my dough is coming together. If you have a dough scraper, that's often helpful at this stage. This is a lot. Remember, this is enough for 3. So your ball you'll be working with is going to be about this size. So is weigh out the amount that we will need. So I'm going to see that this is 1,100 grams. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to scale out 1/3 of that. And a little extra just to be sure. Let's show you the last stage of blending your dough. This part is where you take the palm of your hand and you just sort of press it and almost just like mash it against the countertop. And you're going to do this a few times. And as you do this, the butter is going to get fully incorporated, but leaving a few specks. So this is different from kneading your dough because you're sort of, pushing it out with the palm of your hand. All right, so once you do that, you only need to do it 2 or 3 times. You're going to bring the ball together and cover it with the wrap. And we're going to let it rest in the fridge for at least 30 minutes. This is the part where the gluten in the flour is going to relax. And this part is it's crucial in terms of then letting your crust, it relaxes the gluten and then helps it to get really puffy and flaky later on. If you don't do this, you often will have your crust that sinks down during baking. I don't know if anyone's had that. When I rush this step or just skip it altogether, that's often sort of the outcome. So this is very important, at least 30 minutes, and you can then keep it in the fridge for up to, a couple of days, and then just take it out, and you want to give it at least maybe 10 to 20 minutes on the countertop to come a little bit more closer to ambient temperature before using it. It'll just make it easier to roll out. So we're going to use the same countertop to roll it out in just a bit. But now is when we can start our greens. So it's actually, what I like about this recipe is that you have these built-in windows where you can then work on your next thing and sort of keep going, and it goes pretty fast. So there are a number of options we have tonight for our filling. And afterwards, we're going to make the custard. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about kind of what is out there. Have a lot of you been out foraging already, finding exciting things in the woods?
We do need to do the disclaimer real quick about the whole, like, if you're not 100% sure, please don't eat it. Go to someone who's an expert. I just want to make sure that that's in there, just so that we're making sure people are being safe.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, this is, there's a whole field of foraging. It's an ancient practice that really requires a lot of knowledge to do thoroughly, but there are a few easily identifiable greens out there now this time of year that are safe and healthy, really nutritious. So, but definitely go with a guidebook or go with somebody that knows what they're looking for if you haven't foraged before. But yes, make sure that there are some good apps you can just ID things and make sure you know what it is. Another word I'll mention about just the sort of the etiquette and ethics of foraging is that we are sort of guests in nature and need to only take what we can use and what will be sustainable for the ecosystem that we're in. So I generally try to not forage in areas that are overpicked or that are young patches. And each thing that you're collecting, just be aware of how abundant or not it is, and then sort of adjust accordingly. Dandelions, for example, are abundant everywhere this time of year. And I don't think you could ever overharvest dandelions. So in terms of just general harvesting kind of rules, you want to always be looking for greens from an area that has been undisturbed. Here in the Burlington area, we have a lot of dog walkers, and a lot of the paths in the woods and in the fields, there have been dogs. So I generally try to stay away from anywhere that's within like 200 meters of a road because of the exhaust from the cars, or that's been close to a path where there might be dog walks. So you want to make sure that your plant is as clean as it can be when you harvest it. In general, spring greens are best harvested young. That's when the plant is most tender and when a lot of the best nutrients are available. Later in the season, for some plants, there can be phytochemicals or other chemicals that can be a little harder on the system. So it's good to get young plants. Dandelions, you can harvest anytime. I just find that the texture of the leaf is nicer when it's younger. The entire plant is edible. A lot of folks make good teas or chai from the roots. The leaves have a lot of different vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, has magnesium, calcium. It's got a pretty bitter flavor, so make sure that you like the flavor before you put a lot in. But dandelion is just a great green to use. It holds up pretty well with heat, so you can saute it, or you can use it fresh in salads. The petals, I know a lot of people that like to make dandelion flour pancakes. And you can, that's a really fun thing to do with kids, is to just, make a pancake batter and put in the dandelion head, and you'll have like little yellow pancakes. I like to use the flower petals and just sprinkle onto salads or garnish them with those. So I might ask Carrie to help us. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to pick through the dandelion greens while I go on to the next plant. So I would say in addition to dandelions, one of the most prolific sort of early spring greens out there in most environments, sort of fields, wastelands, borderlands of the woods, are garlic mustard. And these have wilted a little bit, but you can see they have these little heads that look almost like a broccolini flower. I believe they're in the brassica family, and they have a pretty strong flavor. They taste both like garlic as well as that sort of sharp bite of a mustard. And these grow everywhere. These were, I think, down by the at the Intervale. They have a huge patch by some of their like wood chip piles. And yeah, these are great. I don't like to use them only in a salad because the taste is just overpowering. I like to kind of blend them with some other things. So I think they go really nicely with dandelion greens. And then we've got mother nettle. So the nettle plant is one of the I would say most common herbs in European herbalism, and it's just a wonderful nourishing green that is one of the first to appear each spring, and then keeps growing throughout the season. It's best to use nettle in the early spring, or to at least make sure that you're harvesting from young plants, at least even if it's later in the season. Nettle has I think the chemicals in the plant change as it gets older, so it's best to use just the early greens, but also the tip of the plant is what we want. So at home I use my dishwashing gloves to handle nettles. If you're out picking them, you want to take a pair of gloves with you. They do have a sting to them. It's basically they have these little spikes that have a histamine-like substance that just will sort of prick you and give you a sting. It's from the histamine in it, not so much the sort of spine or the spike. But as soon as you boil them or even just wilt them, or as soon as you blend them in a food processor, they lose their sting. So it's totally fine to consume nettle. And so this part is just, it takes a little bit of time, but we're just gonna remove all of the leaves. It's best, it has this sort of thick stem, and it's best not to use that. So there's so many things you can do with nettle in addition to putting them in a quiche. I'd be curious, to hear if anyone likes using nettle. You can put in the chat what your favorite things to do with it are. I like to dry it to use in a tea throughout the season, the winter season. And then my other sort of favorite thing with nettle is to just, I process and have a whole bag ready to go in the fridge. And then I just throw it into smoothies in the morning. And that's sort of my green in the smoothie. So again, as soon as you blend it up, it's not like your tongue is getting those histamine pricks. Are there any questions or ideas about how to use nettle?
Going back really quick to the dough, someone asked if there's a name for that type of kneading with the smearing.
There is. I think it's pâte. Let me just double check. I think it's in your recipe. I may have put it. Yeah, it's pâte, la pâte or le fraisage. It's there under number 4, Fraisage, fraisage. So you can look that up. There are some great YouTube demos also of that step.
I want to know if any of this is considered invasive.
Invasive.
I think it's garlic.
I would say garlic mustard is probably pretty invasive. I'm not sure where it's native to, but okay. So the nettle is ready here. Let me just mention, I decided that for tonight's quiche, since I'll be sending it home with Carrie after class, it would be nice to just show you maybe 3 greens that are pretty easy to find and that are growing really in abundance. So you can harvest as much as needed. So I'm gonna make it with nettle, dandelion, and garlic mustard. I did have ramps to include, but I forgot those in my fridge at home. But ramps are another wonderful spring ephemeral. They tend to grow in deciduous forests, usually on a northern slope near to a waterbed or at least in a very moist soil. Sometimes they'll grow in on sort of other directions as long as there's a lot of moisture in the soil. But ramps are something that we unfortunately have seen an over-harvesting of here in Vermont. So it's really important when gathering ramps to only take the leaves and to leave the bulb unless it's a huge batch and you need the bulb for pickling or something like that. But I generally just try to take 1 or 2 leaves from each plant. Thank you, Carrie. Okay. All right. So so I was going to mention the ramps and then the other options for filling. Carrie mentioned earlier she might make an asparagus quiche. So something that I sort of think is a little reminiscent of asparagus are these fiddlehead ferns. These are the ostrich ferns here on the East Coast. In the Pacific Northwest, I think you have the lady fern. Let me get the exact name. But it's slightly different, but they are still fiddlehead ferns and still edible. Our fiddleheads grow, generally they come out at the beginning of May. And they also like sort of slightly dark forest environments, and any place a fern would generally grow. It's best to get them when they are very young and when the head is still sort of fully closed like a fiddle. That's where it gets its name, like the scroll of a fiddle. It's again important to only harvest a couple heads per plant, and you'll notice they have this little sort of brown skin, almost like that flakes off. People call it, this is sort of similar to a peanut skin. And that is a little bit more bitter than the actual fern. And generally we try to remove those before eating them. So, while you could just throw these all into your custard in the quiche and bake it like that, I would tend to prep the ferns by steaming them, or first just removing any of that. And then I would just do it, maybe a quick blanch, actually. That's what I did. I have a demo quiche to show you, but maybe just blanch these, and that will help. You'll see the water will get really dark, and that will help to remove the sort of the papery skin, and then you can bake them. A word about, I would say, the greens I've mentioned earlier can be eaten raw with no problem. Fiddlehead ferns tend to grow in areas where there is a lot of water. And that tends to often have runoff from farms or otherwise. So it's generally good to wash very well and even just, blanch just to be sure, because they can carry a lot of bacteria. So folks don't generally eat fiddlehead ferns raw. I wouldn't advise it. You can pickle them though, and that the vinegar will help. So just give them, a quick blanch. And then lastly, if you, are interested in mushroom quiches, there are lots of exciting mushrooms out and about. I wasn't able to find any morel to include, but a friend harvested these pheasantback mushrooms, which are a really interesting mushroom. They often are out kind of one of the earliest of the year. You want to get them when they're young because they get a lot tougher as they age. They have a flavor that some people say is similar to watermelon rind or cucumber, especially when they get older. But they're delicious sauteed. I would just sort of saute these with some butter and salt and then put them into the custard. So just some options for what you could include in your quiche.
Yeah, fiddleheads actually have a compound in them that they need to be cooked pretty thoroughly to get eaten. Okay. Yeah, I was just reading that actually the other day.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Yeah.
So definitely, no, I've always, been told to, cook your fiddlehead. So you can then decide how you want to prep your greens. I think in the photo that was used for this class description, there were some beautiful ramps that were really full that hadn't been chopped. You can decide if you want to saute your greens as is. I'm going to just give them a rough chop. And the quantity, feel free to use as many as you like. I think the quantity I gave in the recipe, 200 grams, is pretty generous, about 2 packed cups. That's because I really like greens. But if you're more looking at these sort of as just a garnish or sort of just for flavor, then you can cut down on the quantity. So then in a pretty large pan, I would just put some fat. Usually with this recipe, I have that like little end bit of the butter, that like 10 grams of the butter that was not used. And so that's a great thing to use, to just get your pan coated a little bit with butter. You can just steam these as well. The goal is to really just wilt them so that they're going to go in and fit into the pan.
So Nancy asked, could the water from blanching the ferns be used for a vegetable broth? And I suggested no, because if it is that hot, then again, you're putting that directly in the water, and it's probably going to be super bitter, right? Because you're taking all that bitterness out.
It's a good question, Nancy, because a lot of these, it is nice to use that. We used to call it, where I'm from in Pennsylvania, the pot liquor for vegetable. However, with things that have oxalic acid, like spinach, or chard, or something with this other toxin like the fiddlehead fern, you just need to kind of dispose of that water. But if you were, sauteing or just maybe blanching nettle or dandelion, you could absolutely use that broth then for a stock. Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna then put just a little bit of water to help cook these fully. And you don't need to do them very long. I like to retain the green, but just enough to wilt them down. I'm adding a little salt.
Mark asks, is the 200 grams plus 2 cups of greens post sauteing or the raw weight?
Yes, that was the raw weight. That was the raw weight.
And you measure out the 200 grams and then saute it.
Yeah, measure it out and then saute. Yeah. All right, so don't know how well you can see, but let me show you. This is as much as I'm going to wilt them down. So really just enough so that they are going to fit in the custard. And then you can, I think in the recipe I said set aside to drain. If you've used water, then you want to drain them so there's no liquid. There isn't really liquid in this pan, so I'm just going to set it aside. And Carrie, grab this dough. So let's say that that's been the 30 minutes of rest time in the fridge for our dough. We're resting it a little bit, but you'll get the idea, I think. So when you take the dough out of the fridge, if it's been the full 30 minutes or if it's been there overnight, it's going to be pretty firm. So you want to maybe just give it 10 minutes or so on the countertop. Oh, I didn't grab the roll. Okay. Thank you. So it's good to just, again, create a really good, clean, flat surface that is going to be nice for working your dough. Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Just a little bit of flour is helpful. And we're going to flour the rolling pin as well. And I think it says in your recipe, we're going to do a quarter turns as we roll this out. So we're getting it a little bit flat and then just turn it slightly. And the goal is really to just keep it from sticking. And this is very much sort of personal preference, how you like to roll out your dough. This is actually rolling a little too much. So if that's happening, you can remove the flour. I have a very smooth countertop at my house, so I have to flour it pretty well. But if you have a board, this is really ideal. They even sell pastry cutting boards like this. So it's got a good grain to it. It's good to roll out on. So you're aiming to get it to where it's 1/8 of an inch thick. It's going to puff up. It's going to seem like very thin, but it is going to puff up while it bakes. Are there any questions?
Not so far.
No. Is anyone actually baking along with us tonight?
I did stress in my emails that it was a demo just because
Oh,
of
okay.
the timing of
Totally,
steps.
yeah.
moving it.
No, well, definitely, yeah, you'll have a chance to make it soon. So you can use your dough scraper too. This often is helpful to kind of get underneath and move it around if need be. I actually prefer the metal one for this part because you can kind of get a better grasp on it.
Yeah, if you don't have a bench knife or a dough scraper, get one. They're so useful for so many things other than just dough.
Yes, I didn't realize what I was missing in life before I had a dough scraper. Yeah, anytime you're doing, prep with vegetables, it just helps to kind of get under them and take them to the pan. I think Kiss the Cook on Church Street carries them. King Arthur Flour has them.
I would also love to know if people want to share where you're watching from. We've learned that our cooking classes are reaching a much wider audience, a lot of it through Eventbrite rather than just, Burlington local friends. So if you're watching and you feel comfortable sharing, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from.
Because you may be tuning in from regions with that are much farther ahead in terms of greens.
In the summer already.
Having summer, yeah.
We had snow flurries on May 1st.
We did.
We had snow flurries on Saturday. That's how far behind we are. But it's definitely going green out there now. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Let's hope the snow is over. Okay, so this is still pretty flexible. It's not sticking. It may be a little bit small. Let's have a look. So I wanted to just say a word about pie pans or quiche tins. In general, I like to use a quiche tin with a removable bottom. This is going to be really helpful when you're getting the quiche out. Also, the metal tends to distribute the heat very evenly and also makes it so the dough doesn't slide down as much. I've heard a lot of people say, and it's been my experience, that glass or ceramic tends to be so slippery that the dough will kind of shrink more than in a metal tin. These are the classic French quiche tin. I think it's about 22 centimeters across, about 9 inches. And the next step, I should mention, we'd never grease a quiche pan. That is why, do you think that is? It's because our dough has such a high fat content, it's just not necessary. The butter or whatever fat you've used will more than grease the pan enough as it's baking. So we are going to drape the dough over the pan. And this is the part where it can tear, but it's very easily repaired. And then I like to just gently sort of coax it into the corners of the pan. First, just going around and getting that bottom all the way into the bottom corner. You're later then going to adjust it so it goes into the sort of the top rim. So now that it's sort of gotten the correct amount in the bottom, I'm going to go around the second time and firm it up slightly against the walls so that it takes the shape of the walls. And I'm doing all of this before I cut off the edges, just in case I need to kind of pull it down a little bit like here.
We've got Chicago, Ontario, Vancouver Island, more Vancouver Island, Oxford, Massachusetts, Oregon, Malletts Bay, Toronto. So a lot of Canadians.
Oh my goodness, that's so great. A lot of Canadians. So you guys might even be a little bit behind our spring ephemeral season with what's available there, but no, probably you're pretty close to what we have here. All right, so once that's sort of tucked around into the edges, then you're just going to roll off the dough, being pretty firm. Think of your rolling pin almost as sort of a knife it's sort of helping the edge, the metal edge, be a knife with the dough.
Nancy wants to know if you'd ever do something that's more deep quiche. This seems like a very shallow.
Yes. So the French quiche traditionally are really flat and shallow. That's why they tend to be sort of wider, but I definitely like to do deep dish as well. And this recipe, the pâte brisée, the short crust recipe, works equally well for a deep dish pie. And yeah, if you're doing like an apple pie, that's great. I still do like to use the removable bottom pan. So I have like a deep dish one like that, but then you can remove the bottom. That just helps to get it out. But yeah, I think it was just, you know, I was introduced to quiche in France where they were all sort of these flat quiche. So that's the method I've been using. But yeah, you can absolutely adjust the thickness of the rim. So there we have our crust is ready. You can, you know, press it a little bit more if needed. I like to pull it up just slightly since it is going to shrink. And then the last step is to puncture the holes in the base. The air, the hot air is going to go up under, and if you've ever baked a crust without puncturing it, you've seen that sort of bubble that comes up. So an easy way to make that not happen is to just give it some holes. Don't worry about the custard falling through. The dough will expand enough so that they'll be blocked up by that point.
From Florida as well.
From Florida, oh my gosh, that's great. You probably have so much that's growing out in the woods there. So now we need to do what is called a par bake. And that is an initial bake of just the pastry dough so that the bottom is going to be well cooked. You can imagine if you put the custard in already without baking it, you're going to have that sort of uncooked dough in the bottom. And often we do see that. So in order to avoid that, it's good to do at least 15 minutes of par baking. So to par bake, we preheated the oven to 350, which is going to be the temperature for the full bake. Then I like to use parchment paper. There's a lot of discussion about, is tinfoil better? People say that tinfoil conducts the heat more evenly, but actually I found that parchment paper just does a really good job of getting into the corners and then can be lifted out really easily without sort of breaking or, oh, and I should mention parchment paper is not the same as wax paper. So wax paper you should not use. That's that Reynolds wax wrap, and that is not designed to be heat safe. So definitely don't ever put that in the oven. I think a couple months ago, I was visiting my mother and we only had wax paper and we tried baking cookies on it and that was a disaster. So don't do that. So then you're going to want to weigh this down with something that is going to be easy to remove, that can withstand the oven heat. And there are these sort of fancy pie weights that are pretty expensive, or you can just use any dry legume you might have in your pantry. At home, I have a jar of soybeans that are actually the same size as the commercial pie weights. And I've been baking with those, par baking for like 10 years. And they're super dry, but they're totally good. We're going to use what we have here in the kitchen. These are some yellow lentils, which will be perfect. So we want to give it enough weight to just kind of weigh down the center. The center is especially what tends to rise, and then to go into the corners. I should mention, I read on a forum recently that someone says he's a big baker and he balls up the parchment paper first before putting it down, because he says it gets like, he can get up into the corners a little bit better that way. You could try that. Then it's always good to bake anything that goes in the oven, to put it in the oven on a tray. That's in case of leakage, but then also it's a lot easier to retrieve. So this is going to go in the oven for about 15 minutes. You can do a little bit longer if needed, until it just starts to brown. So thank you, Jay. So while that is par baking, we can finally now get to our custard. So the custard is very basic. And again, it sort of relies on using the best quality ingredient. It makes a big difference, again, the eggs that you use. If you can get eggs with really good yolks. Carrie, can I bother you for perhaps one more egg if we have it? And then your cream is really important as well. You should aim for a cream, if possible, that hasn't been high temp pasteurized. Thank you. So I like to use this cream from Butterworks Farm, where they have just wonderful growing practices. They spend a lot of, they put a lot of energy into making sure the pasture is really nutrient dense, the soil is nutrient dense, and it just has, yeah, really a very sort of full and sweet flavor. And then a milk that is whole milk. I prefer a non-homogenized milk. Stratford Creamery doesn't blend their cream into the milk. They have this one type that where it's not non-homogenized, and I like to get that because again it's just a little closer to the natural state of milk. But give it a good shake if it hasn't been homogenized to get the cream mixed in, and then we're going to scale out, and I believe it's 125 grams of milk and cream. Let's say, or milliliters, yes. So again, this is what's helpful with the with just scaling out your ingredients. I don't need to dirty up a measuring cup for this. We're just going to measure right in. So you can see those bits of cream in. So 125 milliliters of milk. And then I'm trying it back to 0. 125 cream. And this is where we do the 2 full eggs and 1 yolk. I don't need to scale anymore. Yeah. And this is the same custard base as you would use for a sweet custard. So I'm just going to take out the white. Yeah, all these yolks look great. These are, yeah, these look like good eggs. So then we're going to whisk that all together. And you can use an electric mixer or an immersion blender. Some people believe that, you know, by whipping it up, you're going to get a lot more air in there. We were told that you can get just as much air by hand whipping, and you know, we're made to whip up egg whites and make cream by hand, but it definitely does speed up the process if you want to use a blender. And then the last step is to season it with, again, just a pinch of salt. If you're using a cheese that's very salty, like feta, you might want to forgo adding salt. You can sort of see what you think. Then we were in French cuisine, they use a lot of white pepper. So we were taught to use just white pepper, but this is regular pepper, which will be fine. The white pepper has a little more gentle flavor. And then the key ingredient to make it really taste French is just a tiny bit of nutmeg. So in a savory dish, a little nutmeg goes a long way. You want to add enough to just have a hint of it there, but you don't want that to be your kind of foremost flavor. So we're going to whip those together. And then finally, the classic cheese that's used in a French quiche is a Gruyere cheese. So Gruyere is, you know, not a French cheese, which the French are, you know, a little upset about because they do use it. It's used in a lot of French dishes. But it's a wonderful cheese from not too far away, and it's made with a raw milk and then aged a minimum of 12 months. And it just adds a wonderful flavor. We're going to put half of the cheese into the custard, And the other half we are going to put onto a par-baked crust. Now that's a technique that is not called for in all recipes, but I've found that it does a couple of things. Number one, it helps to seal the base. And this is actually something I learned from America's Test Kitchen, did a bunch of sort of trial runs on quiche recipes a couple of years ago. And they found that the recipes that had some cheese on the base, the custard didn't sort of sink through and make the crust so fatty. They even went so far as to then do a second par-bake with the cheese lining the base. And that can be, you know, a good step. I do that if I have the time. So you could just par-bake it for maybe 10 minutes with the cheese. But then also it gives you that flavor of the cheese combined directly with the crust. And that is so good. So, all right. We're going to now check on the crust and see if it's close to being done.
You want me to go grab that?
Yeah, maybe we can see how much is it.
Still 8 minutes on the timer.
Still 8 minutes. Okay, well, maybe we'll give it a couple more minutes. So now is a good time where you can, sort of tidy up.
Nancy asked, the cheese looks very finely ground or grated. Is that?
Oh, yes. Great question, Nancy. So I like to use a microplane to grate the cheese. That's this tool. You know, a box grater is fine, but the microplane really has the advantage of giving you almost this sort of like fine dust of cheese. And why that's helpful here is that it means that it just kind of melts and integrates into the custard cream a little more quickly, and you don't have those sort of stringy little bits of cheese. But yeah, a regular grating is fine as well. The other thing with the cheese is that it's used to garnish the quiche in that we just top it with a little bit of cheese to help with the browning. So an egg custard generally doesn't brown as much as a cheese does. And so by sprinkling a little cheese at the end on the top, and I'll leave out a little bit for that, we're able to give it that nice kind of browned effect at the end.
Someone asked, nutmeg always makes me think of spinach. If you're using spinach, would you cook it first or use it uncooked? Thanks.
Oh, that's so interesting. I always
like
had
cream spinach.
Yeah, cream spinach. No, that brings me back to the cream spinach I would eat in France, where they had it with sort of cream cheese and then some nutmeg. Yeah, so whether you would put it,
whether you would cook it first because it's such delicate green, or whether you would just put it into the quiche.
Yeah, so I would say it would be up to you. With spinach, you could put it in fresh. It generally does get sort of steamed or blanched first, I would say, and then you want to make sure to wring it out so there's no moisture in that when it goes in the
very
quiche.
wet.
Yeah, it can get pretty wet. But yeah, no, a spinach quiche is delicious.
Those are the only questions so far.
Yeah, okay. I just think so. Generally, when you make a quiche in France, a quiche is never served usually in a home setting by itself. If you're out in a cafe and ordering quiche, you'll get a slice of quiche. But typically, it is accompanied by a salad. And I think this time of year, it's really fun to go out and just find, you know, any of the greens that might be edible and enjoyable in a salad, and just make a fresh salad with wild greens. So I would say if you're making a quiche, feel free to hold some of those greens that you got and you're going to use, cooked in the quiche, to then give your guests or your family a chance to sample them raw in a salad. And you can, pretty up that salad with some of those dandelion petals I was mentioning earlier, with violet flowers. There's so much out and about now you could put in the salad. And then I'd say just a simple Dijon dressing would be what's kind of classically served with that salad with the quiche.
4 minutes left on the timer.
Okay, I'd say we can grab that now. Yeah. And while Carrie's getting us our quiche, I'm just gonna prep a couple of the greens to use as our garnish. So if you've done a ramp quiche, I like to do kind of a fine mince of the ramp, almost like you would do with a like chives, or if you've got wild chives. But it's always nice to kind of know what's in your quiche based on your garnish. So don't forget, something I often do is to like throw all of my greens into the quiche, but always, yeah, hold back a couple for your garnish. Or you can just go out to the yard and find something else. Great, thank you, Jerry. So after about 10 minutes of baking, you should start to smell that wonderful dough starting to bake. And let's just, say it's been 15 minutes, and we're going to remove the pie base here. And you can see using the parchment, it's just really easy to then get those out and remove them. I'm seeing that the crust has started to shrink and sort of sink down a little bit. Do you see that?
Zoom in a little bit.
And show you.
Yeah.
So
yeah, you can see the edge.
My idea as to why that happened, sort of the diagnosis for that issue, is just that it didn't have long enough to rest in the fridge. We generally, want to keep it at least 30 minutes, and then sometimes people who are, trying to really be good about not having it shrink will then roll it out, put it into the pan, and then put it into the freezer for about 10 or 15 minutes, and that will then absolutely ensure it's formed, that it's not going to shrink. If you've got that extra time. So I'm going to sprinkle our cheese on the base. And this is where you could just put it back in the oven for 10 minutes and you'll see it becomes almost like this. It's not leathery, but it's almost sort of this film on the bottom, which you can see there's no way the custard would then make the crust soggy.
Do you want to put it back in the fridge, or are we just going to keep it?
No, we'll just.
Not the fridge, the oven.
The oven, yeah. No, because of the time, I'll just keep going. But yeah, you could if you wanted to. But the crust will be okay. So there are a couple of schools of thought for your greens. It's most traditional to put your veggies in first. And and you can just kind of line the base and sprinkle them out. Although some people like to put in the vegetables almost like as a garnish on the top. And if you're wanting to, make your fiddleheads very apparent and not sink in, that could be a good option. So making sure there's even distribution. And then you can pour over your custard. So depending on your, egg size and size of your pan, you may have more custard than you need. So don't try to force it all in, I would say. It is going to rise a little bit. So I kind of like having the veggies stick up a bit so your guests know what they're getting into in terms of the quiche. And then the last step is sprinkling on our cheese. So again, this is what's going to make it brown really nicely. So you could put it in the oven just like that. Or if you wanted to put sort of a whole leaf on top to sort of give an indication of what the filling is, you can put a leaf on top, and that's gonna, cook down a little bit, but should stay on top. Maybe I'll put some of the little floret of the garlic mustard there. So yeah, then that goes back into the oven for another 30 to 40 minutes. The time is less important than really knowing what to watch for. So at this stage, you are watching for the custard to become pretty firm. It should have a slight jiggle, but it shouldn't be sort of soft. You can stick in a toothpick, but generally you can tell just by looking at it or by feel. The edges should be nice and sort of golden brown. and the top will become like nice and, I would say, sort of dark gold. That's what you're aiming for, especially if you put the cheese on. If you haven't put the cheese on, don't wait for it to turn dark gold, because it probably won't before the crust is overbaked. But generally 30 to 40 minutes for this size of a pan works well. I think that should be okay. Great, thank you. All right, so that's going into the oven. And I'm just going to sort of fast forward. Let's imagine that, yeah, we're just kind of waiting for our quiche to bake. Oh, just a heads up, the smell of the baking Gruyere cheese on top is so good. It's gonna fill your whole house and make you really excited to eat the quiche. That's what happened to me this afternoon. So
TV magic. We have a quiche.
yes. So let's imagine we're pulling the quiche out of the oven. And this is what you're aiming for in terms of a crust, and in terms of that sort of dark golden brown color on the top. That again is coming from the Gruyere cheese. The crust is a little bit darkened, but doesn't really have too much. It doesn't have char on it. And if we cut into it, we would see that the base should be cooked through. We shouldn't have that sort of raw dough feel because of the par baking. This was a quiche. This was a sort of green filling that I did today that had everything we made, but also had the ramps in it. So I put a ramp leaf to indicate kind of what was in there. I also like to do that with ramps so that people know it's not like spinach or chard. It's something you notice that leaf is something different than we usually are able to get at the store. And then I just wanted to show another option is with the fiddleheads. And these I did blanch and then just laid them out and covered them with the custard. You could put the custard in and place them on top and have them be a little bit more visible. But I just love the sort of twirl of their shape. They're really fun to work with. I wanted to also show you the way that the quiche, sort of the crust behaves in its pan, since we won't have a chance to watch that one come out of the oven during the class time. But you can see how the crust has sort of shrunk in as well as down a little bit. The shrinking in is really helpful because then it just basically just lifts out of the pan. And see, the advantage of this open bottom pan is that you just basically slide it off like that. And if there's none of the trying to like dig it out with a pie spatula. A word of caution though, if you are baking these for a potluck or picnics with friends, definitely remember to retrieve your bottom plate before you're taking it anywhere. I have lost many a pie plate by just taking it. It's been like, too hot to take off. And so because these two detach, just pay special attention to always keep them together if you're going places with your quiche. But then, yeah, these are ready to serve. Let's take a look at the base. So you can see it's gotten a little bit brown, which is again what we're aiming for. I like this smaller size. It's sort of a nice personal size for one or two people. And quiche can be served either warm or chilled. It's often common in France to have a quiche that's either room temperature or chilled. That's totally fine too. So those are some of the variations of what I like to put in a quiche this time of year. Again, the mushrooms are really good. I think leek and mushroom is one of my favorite combos. If you're, trying to make the traditional Alsace-Lorraine quiche, that has the bacon bits, which are known in France as lardons, and those are the extra fatty part of the pig that are then sort of broken up, and that's actually where our word lard comes from, the lardon, because they had so much fat, they were rendered down. So you can use lardon or bacon bits.
But you cook those first, right? You wouldn't put raw bacon into it.
Yes, yeah. You would kind of melt some of the fat off first, cook them up, and then throw them in. The classic variety in the Alsace region, as opposed to the Lorraine part of that northeastern region of France, they actually have the addition of adding onions in. And if you're being super traditional, they don't use the lardon. Instead, they use speck, which is sort of that nod to the German heritage in that region. So if you wanted to make an Alsatian tart, it would be with the egg, the cheese, the Gruyere, and then speck and onions. But there are so many variations, you know, if you travel around France, you'll encounter all different, especially nowadays, all different sort of creative additions to the custard. Something you could do if you wanted this time of year would be to make maybe a pesto with the maybe ramps and garlic mustard and nettle, make a pesto out of that and swirl some pesto into it. That could be a nice, a fun way to do it too.
Yeah, so we've got about 5 minutes left in class. It's perfect timing. So if anybody has any other questions they'd like to put into the chat, I'll leave the chat box up for just a few more minutes. I will be sending a survey out to everybody tomorrow, wanting to know your thoughts on the class, possible ideas for other classes you might like to see. But if you don't have any questions and you're feeling all set with your quiche making skills, we can go ahead and hit the leave button and that will take you away from the event. But thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks to our lovely instructor.
Yeah, and thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want to mention your email list?
Yeah, just a couple things. Yeah, I would echo that and just say thank you so much for joining us tonight. And really try to get out and about. There are lots of folks in the Burlington area leading foraging walks or nature walks, and can be your guide to harvesting things this time of year. And I do have an email list. If you'd like to be notified of other classes I'm doing, feel free to just reply to Carrie's email tomorrow, and then I can add your email to our list. And I will mention that I'm doing a backyard garden baking cooking class on quiche making, which will include a sort of a sit-down lunch where we'll actually get to do the sampling part of all the different quiches. So that's on May 16th. If you'd be interested in that, I can add you to the list and send you more details. But yeah, best wishes with your quiche baking. It's lots of fun, and hopefully you can experiment with lots of different fillings over the summer season. So thanks again.
Everyone's just saying lots of thank you. Such a fun and informative class. Thank you. I don't know if there's any other questions coming in, but like I said, I'll leave it up for another minute or two in case anybody's frantically typing their last minute question. But other than that, thank you all so much. And we're going to go ahead and end the class in just a minute or two.